Hello, fellow tent pros. Welcome to episode 3 of the Pitchin Tents podcast, brought to you by Top Tech Event Tents with your host, Brian Bolt.
And Davis West.
Here we go, round 3. All good?
I'm loving it.
It's good.
It gives us an opportunity to actually talk about real-world stuff.
Some great feedback so far. Today, what are we getting into?
The pros and cons of pole tents versus frame tents.
And for a lot of you who may not even know, the differences in what a frame tent is versus what a pole tent is. For a lot of those of us that have been doing this for quite a while, we always say when we're training people that we talk about, a lot of times I feel like we leave people behind inadvertently because a lot of us have been doing this a long time. We think we were starting at the basics, but really starting in the middle.
We need to start at 101 rather than 201.
Amen. And like we said originally in episode 1, we're going to really spend some time talking about the true basics. And let's start from what we consider zero.
Absolute
right?
rock bottom and work our way up into the intricates of both of them.
Because our goal in this is to train people and not leave people behind. So before we even get into pros and cons, let's talk about what a frame tent is versus what a pole tent is.
Sure.
I have customers that will ask, what's the difference between a frame tent or pole tent? And then they talk about structures. They talk about sailcloth. At the end of the day, every tent can realistically be divided into 2 categories.
You've got frame tent with subcategories. You've got pole tents with subcategories.
So let's talk about frame tents first.
Okay.
You good with that?
Yeah, let's jump into it.
So by definition, a frame tent is going to have a framework that holds the membrane.
That supports the vinyl.
So that can look a lot of different ways. What's one example of a very basic InDesign frame tent?
I mean, let's just go back to what started all tents out. It's the West Coast style frame tent. 2-inch round poles with sectional tops that either loop and grommet together or clip together or Velcro together, and it's drug across the top and attached by the perimeters.
Yep. So that framework, you're going to build a framework. Typically, you're going to build the roof framework on the ground. You're going to take the vinyl, the membrane, some people still call it canvas, which is old terminology, but drag that over that roof framework, and then you're going to either lift it by hand or with some sort of assisted mechanical device like a tent jack and raise that up on one long side, put those legs under, take the jacks over to the other side, raise that up, put those legs under, and you finish with the 2 legs in the middle of each end.
Or you lift it up depending on how big it is.
Could be.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a variety of ways to do that.
Manual.
So by definition, and we throw it around that, let's even back up. So we talk about West Coast framework. That doesn't mean anything to most people.
We always find ourselves, hang on. All right, we said we were starting at 0. Let's back up.
Let's go back. A West Coast frame, by definition, is a 2-inch diameter tubing that's an 1/8 inch thick on the wall thickness.
And the connection points, how do they connect together?
Steel brackets that are inserted inside the poles. And this is just by definition. And there's a lot of different manufacturers have had different takes on that framework over the years. We don't, here at Top Tech, we don't even build a true West Coast frame. We don't have one. Now,
didn't we used to?
Not even. We had our expandable frame that some of the listeners who may have had that framework years ago, but it was our own take on that because it was spring-loaded buttons, snap buttons style, and so those buttons only protruded through one side of the pole. A typical West Coast frame is going to use quick pins to hold everything together. We say quick pins, R pins, J pins, hook pins.
That's right.
I always tell people I spend half my day trying to figure out what somebody wants because everybody calls something different, right?
Well, it's funny you say something about those expandables. We haven't had any interaction with those in so long. And then I met somebody at ARA this year, and she actually needs an expandable bracket. I had to go digging yesterday. Yeah. Found 5 that are brand new.
Because Keeter's taken over, and that's a whole nother conversation we'll get into later.
And I mean, that's a subcategory of frame tents.
It's a frame tent.
I mean, there's the hybrid of the Future Light under the frame tent and also the Future Track, which is the big version. And
all that is still, for our take on the catered frame tent, not to get too far ahead, but our take on it is still based on a West Coast design. And that can go, I don't want to get into the whole history of that right now, but that's still 1.25 inch Schedule 40 brackets is what it comes down to. So not to get too technical, but frame tents, West Coast frame is a 2-inch diameter, 1/8 inch wall drilled. The poles are drilled 3 inches from the end.
I was about to say that. They're 3 inches from the end rather than your normal 2 that's...
Occasionally we'll have people that want to make a conversion.
That's just a re-drill the hole.
2-keter. It could be, or it could be re-drill the brackets, depending on how their poles are drilled and how their particular West Coast frame was built. But there's multiple manufacturers that make some sort of a true West Coast frame that, again, is drilled 3 inches from the end. A lot of those brackets are truly imported because they're a kind of commodity item.
Well, typically, even now, I'll ask if somebody's trying to convert their West Coast style framework into a future track, the first thing I'm asking is, where on the pole is that hole drilled? Is it 2 or 3 inches? Because that's where we start the conversation.
The conversions can be made, and again, that's not, I don't want to get too far down that rabbit hole today, but that is available. More and more people see the benefits of keter, and again, we'll have a whole other episode on that down the road. So let's talk about another frame tent that's very popular right now, is a lot of people just call it a high peak. Our brand name is a Sierra. There are other manufacturers who make, just about every other manufacturer makes some version of that frame because they're really popular. What's the number one reason for them being so popular? Do you think?
The easy use. I mean, you can throw them up real quick.
2 people, 20 minutes?
I mean,
or less. I've seen them done less.
15 by 15 and 10 by 10, honestly, do it with one person. But there's downsides to them. They're about as fair weather of a tent as you can have.
Yeah, you can't possibly pull those tents tight enough that they won't pond water in really severe weather, right?
And I don't care who you are, that's across the board on that style of tent.
And let's explain what that tent is. So let's just keep it simple. The most common size that you're going to find in that style tent is probably a 20 by 20. So that tent, as opposed to a conventional West Coast frame, a 20 by 20 is going to have 10-foot spacing around the perimeter, which gives that tent 8 legs. A 20 by 20 in the high peak, that is a 4-leg tent. So you've got true 20-foot spacing from corner to corner. It's another reason. That's
spliced.
right. You've got 2 perimeter poles that are spliced in the middle. So it's a little more compact and portable.
Backing up to the reason why it's a fair weather tent, and you're about to point this out, is the top's held up by a suspension cable system.
There's a center pole that carries the top that sits on the intersection of the 2 cables. So the cables run corner to corner. So where they cross, that center pole sits on that intersection. So you don't have a true center pole like in a pole tent we'll get to in a minute, but those the pole doesn't go to the ground, right? It sits on top of the cables. Well, there's only so much tension you can apply to the perimeter of that tent to keep it really, really tight. That's inherent in the design that those tents won't take the equivalent type of weather typically that a traditional frame tent would take.
Something with a little bit more bones underneath the skin.
Having that intermediate leg in between that 10-foot spacing, that leg in the middle of that 20-foot span makes all the difference, okay? And there are other frame tent systems. We have one called the Express. There are other ones out there that are more of a conventional frame, but then there's a high-peak rod that sits in the top of the cluster. So then you can get that high-peak look, but then you go back to 8 legs and you get a true framework under that.
It's an easy conversion from a standard Express.
System, correct.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Those are a couple of ones that are available. Then you get into your more common ketered systems. And I even say, people ask about structure. Well, structures at the end of the day, they're kind of their own category because they're inherently designed differently. But those structures at the end of the day, they're still essentially a frame tent. There's a framework that carries the top.
That's right.
There are other types of frame systems. Everybody's got a different take on keter, et cetera. At the end of the day, those are still frame systems. So let's talk about pole tents. So what is a pole tent by definition? You have to have perimeter poles and center poles, which in other words, that center pole where it penetrates the top in the middle of your tent is going to go all the way to the ground. It's going to be supported on the ground. There's no middle framework. Doesn't matter if it's a conventional pole tent, more basic. We have a brand called Party Canopy, and some people call them over-the-counter tents, so that they could essentially send up to a 30 or a 20-40 or maybe bigger, I don't know. But let's say it's up to, say, a 20 by 40. They could send a customer out with ropes and stakes to put that thing up.
Do people still do that?
I think there are some.
Really?
Not many.
I was about to say.
Not many.
The way that the world is now, I feel like that's just...
Well, from a liability standpoint...
liability, an insurance claim waiting to happen.
People are not going to let Joe Blow that comes in off the street go and put their $3,000 to $5,000 tent up and hope it comes back
in one piece.
Have a hard enough time keeping them up sometimes on their own. But anyway, you got perimeter poles and center poles that carry that top. And again, the new thing, and I say new, essentially over the past 10 years is when it's really taken on, but the sailcloth tents, even they are still, they're kind of their own category, but they're still just a pole tent. Right?
Yeah,
it's just a different shape.
The layout's going to be a little bit different, but going back to pole tents, it's the anchoring that keeps it up.
And you have that's right. And you have side poles and center poles that hold that tent up. And that's it.
Frame tents, the frame holds it up.
Yep.
Pole tents, the anchoring holds it up.
And we say, when it gets to staking, we always say stakes hold a frame tent down, stakes hold a pole tent up.
That's right.
But you have to apply that tension around the perimeter for it to establish enough tension for it to keep its shape in a pole tent. Frame tent, you've got options. And we're going to talk about it again here in just a second.
We'll jump into that shortly.
Let's talk about the pros and cons of each. Okay, so let's jump into pros of a frame tent. Give me one.
So like the first thing that comes to my head, and we're going to go down a rabbit hole here. The ballasting options on a frame tent, you have quite a few more options than you do versus a pole tent. With a frame tent, you got block and roll, you can stake, you can auger, you can put drop-in anchors that are going to hold the tent in the same spot every single time. And then you're more versatile on where you can put that tent. Like on concrete, I'm automatically thinking of frame tent, because with a pole tent, can't really patch concrete unless you're doing permanent anchors there.
Certainly, we've seen just about every application you can think of over the years. And we've certainly had pole tents that have gone up to this. A customer has, say, a venue that's got a concrete pad, and they're going to put up the same tent up all the time. Then they'll put anchors in the ground that they can screw in eye bolts and then connect their out guys.
And I know we talked about this in our last episode about you being the professional and basically directing your customer in the way they need to go. This kind of files right back into that. Because if you have a customer that says, hey, we really want to put a tent here, then your automatic thought, if it's on concrete, is, well, let's go in the direction of a frame tent.
Yep. And certain customers say, I want the pole tent look.
Yep.
And then it's hard to replicate the look of a frame tent or a pole tent with a frame tent, right? The big thing about frame tents is, and I'm just going to use a size just anecdotally. So you've got let's say it's a 40 by 60 frame tent. It can essentially fit in technically just about a 40 by 60 spot.
Let's call it 41 by 61.
Right, because you got base plates that hang out over the edge and that kind of stuff, et cetera. But your footprint that tent's going to take up, minus any out guys that the frame may not need,
is the size of the tent.
The size of the tent. I'm thinking ahead. We had a situation I'll talk about in a second years ago, but let's say it's a 40-60 pole tent. But you got to have let's say 8-foot side poles. We do a 6-foot stake line. So now that tent,
back up. Remember, we're starting at 0. So if it's 8-foot side poles, how far out on out guys?
6 foot.
What about 7?
5.
Okay, just wanted to clarify.
And 10 is 8.
Okay,
typically.
Sounds good.
So we typically will, and certainly that number can be moved at the installer's discretion a little bit. But the problem is, let's talk about that too, on a frame tent, on a pole tent. If you get too far away from the tent with your stake line, you're going to pull outward tension on that top. So you're going to stretch the top, pull it to its shape, but you're not getting enough necessarily downward holding power. If you cheat it in, you're going to get all the downward holding power, but not going to pull it. So that's why we've always said essentially half to 2/3 of the side pole height is what we like to do on a stake line. Not to get off on too much of a tangent, but
but a lot of people might not know that. And talk
True.
About starting at
That's
0,
right.
pole.
That's right. And we're going to talk about, we've got a whole pole tent episode we're going to do coming up, and we can get into the guts on that too. But the stake line. So a 40 by 60 pole tent is going to need, assume a 6-foot stake line, meaning those stakes are going to be 6 foot away from the side poles all the way around. So 40 is going to be 52 for 6 and 6 on each side. And then 60 is going to become 72. So point being is, if you've got a frame tent, you've about got a 40 by 60 spot you could put that in. If that same tent is a pole tent, because of stake line, now I'm at 52 by 72. So it can't go in the same tight spot that a frame tent can. So that makes, just by virtue of that, makes a frame tent a little more versatile.
Right. And to me, that would fall under the cons list of a pole tent, because the parameters that you have on a pole tent, you have to think, just because it's a 40 by 60 doesn't mean I could put this pole tent in a 40 by 60 location.
Give me some other things about pros on frame tents.
Well, do you want to talk about this? Because this is something that a lot of people talk about. And I had this as a pro under my frame tents, is that it's a stronger skeleton. But that's not necessarily always the case.
Aluminum is super strong, right? But it also depends on the extrusion, because there's multiple extrusions. We've seen them all. Those of us that have done this for a while, there's multiple extrusions in every shape and size these days. So to think that naturally a pole tent is stronger, a frame tent is stronger, that's not necessarily the case, because there are pole tents on the market that are engineered. They carry an engineered stamp that they meet a certain wind load.
It's like our
and there are equivalent size frame tents that may not be built. Let's say it's a 2-inch frame versus a true tension tent. Like you said, our brand is an Epic. If I take the same size frame tent 40/60 2-inch frame versus a 40/60 Epic, which that tent has 12,000-pound webbing that runs through and essentially makes the skeleton of that tent.
Especially if you're outguying it with full out guys, 5-hole stake bars, web guys, 3-hole stake bars, the whole ordeal. That one's going to outperform that 2-inch.
I have seen those 40/60 Epics go through some stuff that 2-inch frame has no chance.
Gone.
No chance.
Yeah.
I don't want to say carte blanche across the board that frame tents are necessarily stronger than pole tents. It depends on the situation. But by and large, if you get up into the bigger sizes, you get bigger, stronger extrusions, then those tents carry some big wind loads.
Right. You've got the extra bracing, the extra cables, stuff like that help strengthen.
And you don't have all that with a pole tent.
The pole tent equivalent to that is the 2-inch heavy duty webbing.
Yeah. So we like to say too that a lot of the pole tents, because of that, frame. I use them interchangeably. The frame tents, because of that, are essentially more versatile, especially when you get up into today's Ketered frame tents. They are really versatile with the types of clamps and bells and whistles that you can put on them.
The accessories nowadays have become endless.
Yeah. People want to rig them up with all sorts of lighting.
That's how you dress it up at an event. But going back, asking about what's another pro for a frame tent, this is something that was always loved. You have full use under the tent. Whereas versus a pole tent, you're going to have center poles down the center of the tent. So that right there, if you're having a wedding, those center poles,
you don't get a center aisle with a single pole tent.
Unless you go to a twin pole, you're going to lose some of your square footage underneath that's usable. There's ways to dress it up and make it functional, but oftentimes for big events like that, they don't want anything under the tent that's going to interfere with the event going on, dance floors that are going to be out. Seating becomes a more difficult. You
got to work around those center poles. 40/60 has 2 center poles that go from the center of the top down to the ground.
Do they look elegant and beautiful? Absolutely, but there are cons to a pole tent.
It's trade-offs. Depends on what you want, and that's why the listeners to this podcast need to understand these are the conversations you need to have with your customers and educate them and become the professional.
It goes back to your first site visit. I mean, that's the
kind
of questions that you ask in the first site visit. Like, one, what's the tent going to be used for?
What's your ultimate goal?
Is it just seating and dance floor, et cetera, or are we ceremonying under here? Because if we're going to have a ceremony under here, that bride is not going to like those center poles down her aisle that she gets to walk
saw
down.
one time. It was pretty creative, I thought, and it was somebody wanted the look of that high peak look of a nice bigger pole tent
with the dramatic swoops, and
they had a center aisle down the middle that wove in between the center poles, so the bride had to
hang on a second. So she went down like a snake.
Oh yeah, with rose petals.
Oh gosh!
Right? So instead of right down the middle, meander through the center poles.
You think they practice that a lot?
They might have. Might have. So,
what do you got on your list for a pro?
Let's talk about different configurations. You won't see it so much in that West Coast frame style that we just talked about, but when you get into today's modern Ketered system, and again, a lot of the different manufacturers have them, you have a lot of different styles available to you. It's easy to customize these frame tents.
In increments of even 5.
Yeah, and that's just mid-sizes. I'm talking hips, gables, porch ends,
band shells,
internal walls. Like you can we've seen situations before. So instead of having a separate catering tent, you essentially put an internal wall to chop that tent up into sections. That's available to you. You would not be able to do that so easily with a frame or with a pole tent because you're going to end up.
Well, there's no connection point really to divide.
You would literally have to lace in a wall at the lace line.
Yep.
That's about what you're limited to. Even still, in the case of a 40/60 pole tent, normally those are going to be in 20-foot sections. So you got your 40/40 set of ends with 20-foot midsections. Normally, by and large, you're going to see your pole tents limited to midsections that are half the width. So in the case of a 30 wide, that's a 15-foot mid. 40 wide's going to have a 20. 50's odd. We do a 50 wide that's got a 20 and a 30 option. And we do a 20 and 30 option in 60, but most likely the most common in your 60 wide single pole tent's a 30-foot mid. Again, half that width. It just works that way. But it's also, you're limited on what you can do. Alternately, you start talking about a 40 wide, forget the 40/60, 40 wide Ketered frame tent. You offer that with a 10, 15, or 20-foot mid. So now we can get that in within a 5-foot increment increment. And sure, we can do custom mids and half, but you can literally put that in a very tight.
Like you said, it is a more versatile tent.
Give me your length in inches and we can meet it. And that's an easy thing to customize. People ask us all the time about customizing, say,
example,
like on a Future Track.
We did a 28 by 28 and a 29 by 29 footprint. And we
just did a monoslope. It's 25 by 29. Exactly. 25 by 30 didn't fit.
That application, you can't do that at a pole tent.
No, but that keeter to keeter dimension, when those of you who know what we're talking about with midsections on ketered tents, the keeter to keeter, not the width of the tent, because that's let's say in the case of 40 wide, that's a 40-foot dimension. That's that we can and have customized those, but that's not as readily available as what we would say is the length, which technically is a smaller dimension here, 40, let's say it's a 40-15 mid. If you want to make that a 40 by 12 and a half, that's an easy thing to do.
Right.
Very simple.
Like you said, bring it to me in inches and
I can meet it to whatever. The point being those are readily customizable that way.
What about installs in terms of a pro and a con versus pole and frame? Do you think that frame tent allows you for longer installs? Like, are you going to sleep better at night with a frame tent up, outguide properly 2 poundage per square foot versus a pole tent?
Let me put it this way. I have seen what our big pole tents are capable of, especially 40-60 wide specifically, the big single pole tents.
Full install.
Even a twin pole is kind of its own thing. So let's talk 40, the bread and butter, 40 and 60 wide single pole tents. I know what they're capable of. I don't think twice about putting those up for long term, but I will tell you, if you've got impending weather, the ketered frame tent specifically is a lot better friend to you because you have within minutes, you can remove the vinyl.
I was about to say.
And leave the frame standing.
That's a huge pro to a frame tent is you can take that top off, leave that frame still standing, and go back in after the weather's cleared up and put those back in or on. Say it was a West Coast, you could put it back on, leaving the frame up. The frame's most likely going to withstand any weather because there's
let the wind blow through it.
Pass through.
Let the wind blow through it.
Whereas a pole tent, if you do have weather like that, and it's the smartest thing to take the tent down, you have to uninstall the tent.
There's only one way with a pole tent to get the vinyl out of the way is to totally disassemble the tent and put it on the ground.
That's right.
And pop all your straps loose and literally put...
That to me is probably one of the biggest pros of a frame tent.
Give you some evidence. And I think I may have talked about the same installation on the last episode when we were talking about the power situation, but we had a issue years ago with a customer in Eastern North Carolina that had a 40 by 100 pole tent up on a pad. 14 inches of snow took that tent down. As they talked about what to replace it with, we ultimately landed on a gable-ended Future Track ketered tent because, it gives them a lot more options for lighting and fans and all that other stuff, fire extinguishers, you name it. They've got the ability to put all that stuff nice and neat, attached to the framework or however they're going to put that up.
It's cleaner.
But what sold them on that that application was the fact that if they had weather coming again, within a matter of within a half an hour, they could have all those tops out of that tent
100%.
And on the ground. And then they would not lose the entire thing. They had a lot of other...
And that was in North Carolina, right?
Yeah, Eastern North Carolina at a winery. But, they had a situation where they had tons of just equipment, refrigerators, you name it. I mean, this was up long term, so they outfitted the thing, and they knew that to take that tent down entirely, it was not applicable.
Right. It wasn't really an option for them to have to do continuously.
Not at all. So
taking those tops out is a whole lot easier of a job than taking a whole full pole tent down.
No doubt about it. And a lot quicker, just easier on the installers altogether. All right, so let's shift a little bit. Let's talk about the pros of pole tents.
And then we'll hit the negatives of both.
We've seen a lot of movement in the pole tent world over the years with sailcloths have come in, but at the end of the day, they're not going to take the type of a day-to-day abuse that
a frame tent will.
Well, or a pole tent will. Even like a sailcloth to a regular, a real, and I say a real pole tent, a tension tent. A tension tent that's got a lot of webbings and stuff, and typically a blackout top. And I mean, those are incredible. Not to say that sailcloth aren't, because they certainly are, but they're strong enough. But they don't take the place of doing what necessarily a true tension tent can do.
Well, like I said, it still falls under the category of the pole tent, but you have classifications underneath that pole tent that these different styles fall underneath because you have to break it up based on their capabilities. A pole tent is still probably a pole tent, but the capabilities of each individual style of pole tent varies.
Pros of a pole tent. Less parts?
A whole lot less parts.
I mean, pretty straightforward. You got a bunch of stake bars, straps, that kind of stuff, but you're going to have volumes of that stuff, not different types of. You're going to have tops, you got ends and mids, you got side poles and center poles.
And your center poles can break down into multiple parts. And that was one of the things I had as a pro here is, if you have a smaller company that doesn't necessarily have these big box trucks that are capable of carrying a 22-foot pole, like a 22-foot rafter on a 40 wide.
Essentially break into two 10-foot sections with a connector, right?
You can fit a 40 by 80 pole tent in the back of a painter's van. I've done it. Legitimately.
That's right.
I mean,
it's pretty nimble that way, right? You don't need to have...
And you can still get the same square footage. Well, I take that back. Just about the same square footage minus the center pole. And essentially, it's the same square footage as a 40-60 frame tent if you put up a 40-60 pole tent, and you have less involvement in getting that pole tent there.
It gives you a look that you're not going to get with a frame tent.
A whole lot different of a look. A way more dramatic. I mean, the frame tent to me is it's the new conventional thing. The pole tent was the dramatic, elegant kind of feel to it, dress it up with decorations and stuff and make it look like an old style plantation style tent. Whereas the more modern look is something you'd see drop dead in the middle of Atlanta.
You have a lot of other valance styles, et cetera. That's one thing we didn't talk about on the frame tent. You can choose a lot of different valance styles, and we look at valance as a lot of times it's more function as form, meaning that it looks a certain way, but it's also function. And when we get into other episodes, we'll talk about functions of valances and why we do them different ways. But with pole tent, you're pretty limited. Yeah. Like we do, everybody knows that knows our Epic is a bat wing valance. It's a different style, meaning we pull from the point of the valance instead of the most pole tents are going to have some sort of interface that you attach the ratchet or rope to where the side pole penetrates the top. The Epic's a little different because we pull away from that. And that tent's got a series of webbings and all that kind of stuff in it. But at the end of the day, you pretty much got a straight or scallop valance, and then you've got like a batwing valance with our style tent, which is a whole different tent design. You can't change that. In the case of a ketered frame tent, you can have your existing frame. You decide you want to change your valances.
You can.
You put different tops in that same frame.
Like you said, we typically with a pole tent, you're going to have batwing style, straight or scalloped. But then you go into the frame and you've got catenary, you've got single straight, you've got single scalloped, you've got double straight, you've got double scalloped. Yep. I mean, the possibilities there are endless.
We didn't even talk about clear.
You didn't let me finish my thought.
Sorry.
I was about to say, and another thing with frame tents is you can put in clear tops. Right. Whereas a pole tent, you can't necessarily. Let me take that back. We've seen it before, but the strength of that goes substantially down because you got to remember, like we said earlier, the tension on a pole tent is holding that tent up. And in order for that to happen, you have to apply a certain amount of tension. When you apply a certain amount of tension to clear, what normally happens? You're
relying on the strength of the material, although you've got webbings, but you're also relying on the scrim inside the material to help make the outer shell, let's call it, of that tent. A frame tent, the framework's doing that work for you, so you have more options. So you start pulling tension on clear and you get a hard rain, and in a warm day, good luck with that.
Yeah. The stakes aren't going to pull out. The top's just going to sag.
Then the stakes pull out.
I also got the pole tent for a pro. It's less expensive to purchase and to rent.
Let's say you base it on square footage, right? Equivalent square footage of your pole tents are typically going to be less. So people a lot of times carry a lower install rate with that and rental rate.
And going back to, we just got back from the road, and a lot of the conversations that I had on the road were people nowadays want to rent the more expensive stuff because they think it's higher quality. That goes back into pole tents too, and I think that's why you're not seeing as many of them is because people want something that's more, I paid this for this, so I'm thinking I'm getting a better quality product. That's not always the case, but we are seeing pole tents become less and less popular.
It's kind of like implied value. They think that just because they're paying more, they're getting something better, but it's just different, right? And it goes back to, not to beat a dead horse, but it goes back to that whole conversation at the site visit or meeting with your customer and talking them through. And what we're trying to do here is to give you the ammunition you need to have these conversations with your customers that you may not necessarily think about on the fly or in the heat of the moment. But if I was a rental company, make a list of pros and cons on frames versus pole tents and then use that to help drive which way
it drives your sale. And then you can sit there with your client and say, here's pros and cons. What are you looking to do? And then you work through that list. And then by the end of that list, you're going to have narrowed down what they want. And then at that point, that's when you start placing the big orders.
And that positions you as the expert. So your customer is going to immediately trust you because...
As long as you tell them the right stuff. Don't lie.
Fair enough. Can you use ketered walls with pole tents?
That was a good one. In short answer, yes.
Let's talk about what a keter wall is, just real quick.
Yeah. So on typical frame tents, you talk about Future Light, Future Track, whatever keter system you have. You can integrate keter walls, keter sliding, or keter hanging.
So that sidewall engages into the leg extrusion.
And up and either attaches to the curtain rope or the slider balls engage into the perimeter pole underneath in the truck. Yep. You can do that on a pole tent. You can use what we have as our Future Light legs, or Future Light leg sleeves.
It has a pin and a cap in the top
in
in
the top. It even has a stake receiver in the bottom, so you can stake the base at the bottom so that leg doesn't move.
Yeah. And real quick, let me just jump in real quick. So the problem with those walls, since they're engaged in the leg, if the wind blows, it's going to take that leg out with it.
That's why you need to
so you have to be able to stake through that base to keep it in the same place.
Classic party rentals in Atlanta, Steven Eisenstein, that's how they do their pole tents from us, is they use keter walls.
Super clean look.
It looks so much better. Otherwise, you're going to have to just do either Velcro or lap and snap all the way around and attach that to the curtain rope at the top of the pole tent. But back to those walls, on a pole tent, you can't do keter sliding walls. The only application you have there is keter hanging.
That's essentially the big list of the pros on the pole tents. Let's talk about some of the not so good stuff. Why would you shy away from a frame tent? Doesn't matter if it's ketered, whatever, non-ketered.
I think one of the biggest things for me is the equipment needed for a frame tent in order to install and transport. I think that you're more married to bigger equipment and bigger trucks with a frame tent than you are, well, let me back up, with a bigger frame tent than you are a bigger pole tent. So let's just go back to our 4060, for example. A 4060 frame tent, you're going to have at least a 22-foot box truck. What would it be? 25-foot box, 23-foot box?
Oh, 26.
26.
So, yeah, that's what most people have.
Unless you let them hang out the back. But because that 40-wide rafter
is
22.2. So, at a very minimum, you have to have a capability to transfer that pole, that 22-foot pole, from point A to point B. So, for me, that's a con, because if you are a smaller business starting out and you haven't had the availability to throw dollars at a big transfer equipment, then I might start at a pole tent and get some equity built up in it, and then move to a frame tent once I got the transport under control.
What about labor between the two?
Yeah.
Would you put any, let's just keep with that 40-60 size.
Yeah.
Would you put any more people on one or the other? Assuming you had all the time in the world to make the install, you weren't up against a gun and had to get one up in 2 hours, whatever the number is.
You could do a pole tent with less people.
Especially with today's equipment that is available to people, right?
I mean, if you're still jerking center poles up by hand, then let's take a step back and put me 4 people on that center pole. Because, I've put up a lot of pole tents. Event rentals, we put up a lot of pole tents. And, it wasn't nothing for us to have to use 4 or 5 guys to get that first center pole in.
The biggest problem a lot of people have with the pole tent getting the center pole in is they have it too tight to start.
100% on the corners. And then you fight it. That's one thing about a pole tent, is you have to listen to the tent more on a pole tent than you do a frame tent.
Agreed. And I say the way a lot of people put a pole tent up historically is more art than science.
Yeah.
We train putting those up to be much more scientific. I'll explain that later.
What do you got?
Another episode.
So I've got more equipment needed.
I think you need probably a little more skill to put up bigger, more modern type.
I've got that written down
pole tents.
It's a more advanced,
frame tents.
It's a more advanced level style tent.
Yeah, because again, the way that we train on pole tents is I would train your crews to do a 20 wide, and this is going to sound crazy. I would train your crews to do a 20 wide and an 80 wide. It's the same thing. It's just bigger parts, but the process is identical.
The way you lay out a pole tent should not change from one size to the next, unless it is I said one size to the next, not different style. The layout for a sailcloth is going to be different than your layout for an epic.
Just because of rounded ends, etc.
But in terms of how the maths, it's the same thing every single time.
Yeah, and the frame tents get more complicated typically the bigger you get. Even within the same system, there are parts that you're going to see in the bigger tents that you didn't see in the little tents.
Exactly.
But a sectional pole tent is more stakes and bars and that kind of stuff when you get bigger.
That falls into a con on the frame tent too, is there is more parts. And something I didn't even write down that we just talked about as a con for a frame is point A to point B, getting that tent from point A to point B.
Just moving it around.
And we talked about...
And the space that it takes in your warehouse.
That's a huge one, because how much it takes up in a warehouse compared to how much a pole tent takes up in a warehouse is like, it's not even a comparison.
I've had this conversation with our own people here. When you pack and ship an order, let's say you missed a bracket on a frame tent. That tent's done.
Yeah,
you can't put it up without it. If you miss a stake on a pole tent, you might have a little more leeway.
Right. If you get to a job site and you're putting up a 40 wide gable end and you have 3 rights instead of 2 rights and 2 lefts on a gable ended bracket, guess what that tent's not doing today until you get the right bracket.
And not going up.
If I get to a pole tent, I don't have 2 poles. Let's say I don't have 2 poles. I can leave those 2 poles out that's not on a lace line or a corner and come back and get them and still get the job put up and then swing back by and put those last 2 poles in. If I don't have 2 poles for a future track, guess what?
Not going up.
It's not going up.
Okay, I think we've hit pretty well on the pros of both. Go ahead.
One more. Frame tent's going to be more expensive to purchase.
Per square foot, typically it is, right? But especially when you get in those bigger sizes, it's going to be, those extrusions are not cheap.
And they're more expensive to rent too. And so they might not in today's world, but back before frame tents became so popular, I'm sure price point was a reason why frame tents didn't rent as well as pole tents did.
And people ask about, say, hips versus gables, while we're talking about that on frame tents, which I don't even know. I'd have to go and look and see what we do more of these days, but gables have certainly mostly taken over. But people will ask, what's more expensive, a hip or a gable tent? Within the same mid-configuration, same square footage, all things being equal, a gable-ended tent's can be more expensive because it's got 4 more of the keter drafters out on the end that a hip tent wouldn't have. Those are the most expensive poles in that tent.
Right, because you have to extend that last mid out. It's not a hip slant down. That's all made of mids, so you are going to have extra rafters on.
And the other question people ask me is, and you've heard this a ton of times too, is what's easier to put up? I mean, what's your skill level?
To me,
I don't even think about it. I love to do a big pole tent.
Yeah.
I love putting up big pole tents. It's like immediate gratification.
But to me, I'll probably hear a lot of slack from this. A future track gable-ended tent is easier for me to put up than a future track hip-ended tent.
Why you think that is? Because all the mids are essentially the same?
That it's easier to get a crew to understand, one, because you're just throwing mids in. And 2, once you have that gable end built,
you just build off of it.
It's just like throw it down. And to me, I could put a gable end together a whole lot quicker than I put a hip end together. It's less poles.
I think we should race.
Oh, where are you at?
I'm not the most competitive. It's funny you say that. No, Davis is more competitive than anybody I know, which is good. But it's funny you say that because I typically say I think a hip's easier, and there's no right or wrong.
No,
and I'm just telling you, my thing is because hips have more parts, but it's all pinned. You don't have to bolt anything together on the ends.
Well, and
it's all pinned together.
The thing about the hip is there's a way to go ahead and put that hip, all the poles connected without getting up on a ladder too. And
correct. And we show that in the field quite often. And because being on a ladder, back to our safety episode last time, we try to look for opportunities to keep people off of ladders. Yeah. The less time you're on a ladder, less likely you are to get hurt. So let's talk about cons on pole tents real quick. So
what you got? Let's let you start.
Well, we kind of touched on it that they're simple in design, so you have less accessories that you can put on those. So our extrusions in the ketered systems, again, and I know we talked about West Coast frames being round profile. There's minimal that you can do on those, but then let's kind of stick with, which are very popular these days, your more, your hybrid, let's say ketered frame tents, or even your full structures. There's a lot of clips, clamps, things the ways to interface.
There's unlimited connection points.
Yeah, and there's ways to interface with that framework to hang, you name it. I've seen all kinds I had a question last week if we can hang a trapeze from...
Another thing, too,
touching that one.
Like, you can hang heavier objects.
That's right.
Whereas if you're trying to hang something from a pole tent, one option that you have is to run a cable from center pole to center pole. And even when you do that, you have to be careful on how much pounds you put on that, because when you start putting weight on in between center poles, what does that do to the center poles? It draws them together.
It's transmitting the loads back through those webbings and into the tent top because there's no frame to distribute that.
And you're fighting against what that tent's designed to do, which is to pull those center poles out.
You're working against it a little bit.
Not to say it can't be done, because it person here has done it.
Well, and it can and it has been, but it's got to be done the right way and with utmost safety in mind and with the right product. You can't just do that in any...
I was about to say, and it has to be within the product's capabilities.
What do you have?
Heck, we already kind of covered this, but like you said, less accessories. To me, it's an older style looking tent. I think there's a time and place for them, but I just think that the way the industry and what the consumers now are wanting out of a tent, that it's kind of dated.
I say all the time, more and more, the longer I do this, the more people want a tent to be a building.
That's right. That whole temporary structure that gets thrown around has become more and more of, let's get a permanent solution in here.
And we touched on too that they're not necessarily best for long-term installations because of what has to happen to protect them from the elements.
Right.
And now we're talking about products in a lot of these cases that are engineered. And I'm telling you, I've seen them take some stuff that you wouldn't think a tent needs to be going through. Heck, we had a Galaxy that we do. It's essentially a pole tent that was up for 4 years up here. So everything,
that tent was...
That's 6 stakes, one center pole, and it was up for 4 years without retention.
If any of y'all went to Matra this past year, it was the black Galaxy that we had up there with Brian's car up underneath it.
We had a red and white version that we put up 4 years ago, and it has never been down.
I will be completely honest. I would put that tent up against any tent out there for a long-term install.
Right. But there was no sidewalls on it, so the wind was able to get through it, etc.
But the pitch of it, too, doesn't allow anything to stick, no ponding. I mean, even if it snowed all the way up to the top of that center pole.
Yeah, but even that tent, if we were worried about it, even still, it's a pole tent, so you got to take it down. You pull the center pole out of it, drop it on the ground. You don't have the ability to take tops off the tent and leave it.
And for me, that is one of the biggest selling points of Future Track or Future Light for me, is the fact that you can put that up and without disassembling the entire freaking tent, you can take out those tops and walls and ride out a storm.
So let's talk about anchoring between the two. Well, you talked about ballasting. So I don't want to blow past that either, but ballasting is essentially putting temporary weight around the perimeter of a tent and not penetrating the ground. So the weight sits on top of the ground. That could be a lot of different... Concrete's taken over. Concrete's become the standard. Again, I'll say it again. That's a topic for another time. But
let's test out how long we can get an Epic to stay up if we tension it down with water barrels.
We have people who have asked, and I see it even on the online forums. There's some popular Facebook forums, et cetera, and people ask, what's the right weight for holding up a pole tent? I don't know. I don't know what it's sitting on. I don't know what you're going to use for... Not all ballast is created equally.
Well, I'm sure if we sat down and took the time, we know how much a double head stake holds.
In average ground.
Yeah. I would love to know, because we do that pulling.
We have done it with a water barrel.
I would love to know, just taking all the numbers and going around each stake and saying, okay, this one holds this much, and then take a full install on a 40x60 and see how much holding power those stakes actually supposedly have.
Oh, you can test it. But people ask us about ballasting a pole tent, but I've heard people essentially want me to say you can't do that. I'm not going to say you can't do that. The problem is the weight required is so astronomical to get the type of holding power you're going to get with a 3 or 5 hole stake bar and still be able to get in and out of the tent. And getting out of the tent is as important as getting in it from a safety standpoint. And if you got ballast in the way, and I've seen big concrete jersey barriers, the ones that are 4 to 6 feet wide and weigh 2,000 or 3,000 pounds a piece. I've seen those used.
But it still goes back to that same point of those ballast hold that tent up.
That's right. So they cannot move.
So if you don't have enough, then that tent's going to come down.
Yeah. So I'm not going to tell you can't put ballast around a pole tent. I'm just telling you that by the time you put the amount that you would truly need to hold it, and 2 things about a pole tent. You got a static load, meaning how much anchoring power you need to hold that tent up just for it to hold its shape. And then you have a dynamic load. Like if you look at our engineering on that, there's actually two numbers. There's a static load and then a dynamic or a proof load on that. So let's say this tent was engineered for 70 mile an hour winds, just throwing out a number. So let's say it's X for to hold that tent up. It's got a bigger number when 70 pounds of wind is pushing that on that for 3 seconds.
Correct.
So that's why typically by the time you get enough weight around the perimeter of a tent, you're probably outside the capabilities of a pole tent.
To be honest, in order to get all that weight there, you'll probably lose your ass on the job anyways.
We say all the time, the cost isn't in a ballast, the cost is in moving it around.
That's exactly right. And that's, we have that conversation with our customers all the time. Well, we become a transport company.
We've already talked about the center poles down the middle of the tent. That was a kind of a negative that you don't have to deal with in a frame tent because it's, people use the term clear span, but clear span to me by definition is essentially there's just nothing in the middle of the tent.
And that kind of covers a frame tent.
Anything else that we need to talk about? I think we've kind of covered most of what we wanted to.
Just to end, question, why would you want one or the other or both in your inventory?
Well, it depends on the size of your operation. I like that you said, too, that early on, you may want to think about a less expensive option that comes with maybe a lower rental rate that you can do with fewer people. All that works and
still get a pretty decent sized square footage out of
works,
it.
Sure. And that works to the benefit of a small company, right? I like that you could do that. So
it's a headway into the industry, I think.
But I think it also has to do with where you're located. So if you're in more of a rural area, there's a greater chance you're going to be in locations where you can stake. If you're in more of an urban area, you know what? Pole tent's probably not your thing because you're going to end up in a lot of situations where you just can't stake it.
That's right. And going back to a pole tent, though, if you are thinking about a pole tent or haven't gotten into a pole tent before, I'll be honest, there is a lot of companies that we rep that started their business on the back of an epic pole tent.
And they're workhorses and as bulletproof as you can possibly get for today's tension tents. And then we talk about the versatility of a frame tent. There's no second guessing how versatile a frame tent is for your inventory. So as a manufacturer who makes both, I think you need both. But
yeah, why not? Have both options at least.
And many, many, many of our customers do because they've seen applications for each. It's like I always say, it's like a boat, and you can't buy one boat that's going to do it all.
We'll say one more thing, a con about pole tent. Can't gutter them.
You can't gutter beyond a leg. You can't go past the leg typically.
But it's a whole lot harder to gutter.
Yeah, because you have straps at every either 7.5 on a 30 wide or 10-foot spacing on pretty much everything else. So you're pretty well limited to a 10-foot gutter.
That's right.
Right. So you just have a marquee. That's why our number one marquee that we sell is a 9 wide, so it'll fit between the 10-foot straps of pole tent. But you can gutter between the poles, but you can't go past the pole because you got the straps.
Right. But you couldn't put 2 40 wides beside each other and gutter between them.
Nope, I've had plenty of people try. You end up with straps inside of each opposite tent.
Yeah,
I've seen it.
Cluster.
And that's an application for a different tent
that goes back to you being a professional and saying, that's going to look like trash. Here's a better option.
There's another way to do this, right? Anything else?
I think we pretty much summed up everything there is to know about a frame tent versus pole tent. Obviously, we're going to dive a little bit deeper in a later podcast in frame and keter. For poles, a pole tent's a pole tent. It's pretty straightforward. It's the tension that you put on it holds it up in the air.
Frame tent is driven by the shape of the framework.
That's right.
Essentially. I want to thank everybody for listening, and it's been a great run so far with the podcast. We got some great feedback so far, and I can't thank Davis enough for sitting here with me and doing this. And it's a lot of fun. We got a lot of content lined up, and again,
it is fun. We get to talk through what's going in our minds constantly all the time and share it with other people.
We have many of these conversations in passing and with customers and bouncing back and forth between offices and talking this out and training our own internal people. But it's great to put this all down so that it's a one confined place where people can hopefully learn from. We don't know it all. And I'll be the first to tell you after almost 21 years in this business that if you're not willing to learn, you're backing up.
I learn every time I go out on the road.
And if you're not willing to learn something new, and I always say I learn as much from our customers and interacting with them and sharing information. And when I say sharing information, we impart wisdom when we can, but you better be willing to listen because there's a lot of people who have been in this industry that have done it different ways. The good thing about where we sit is we're able to combine all of that. And a lot of the ways that I teach any of this stuff now, I have taken from customers over the years.
So have I.
There are certain things that I've purged that don't need to be repeated. But there's plenty of info that we've gotten from those of you who are in the field or making your living doing this.
Yep. So we appreciate the feedback we get from y'all as well.
Absolutely. All right. So with that, we're signing off. That's episode number 3.
Where are you headed next week? You're on the road again.
I am on the road going to Major Spring Training West Coast in Arizona. So I'll be out there and look forward to seeing any of you who have heard this by that point. Look forward to seeing you and let's talk about it.
Heck yeah.
Until then, we'll see you
later, taters.
Thanks.